this is probably maybe about as simple of a message as you'll ever get. This is pretty much just a message of encouragement as Paul is closing out this letter. But he's talking about what he wants our minds to be set on and the things that he wants us to be thinking about, the things that he just wants us to be focused on and growing into and becoming. And I just think, as I preach through books, it's really a huge blessing to me because I spend so much time in these books. And as I go through them, I think I come out of these books and I just have this crazy encouragement that I'm like, man, I want to be that, and I want to do that, and I want to grow in that. I remember after going through the Sermon on the Mount, I was like, man, I want to serve God and his kingdom, and I want to be, and I want to reach out to those in need, and I want to do these things. I want this so much. And here in closing, Paul is really telling us the things that he really wants us to do and be as he's drawing this letter to a close. And I think it's really neat to me. But he says in 4 verse 8, he says, finally, brothers. And this time, he's actually drawing this letter to a close. He said this earlier, and then he seemed to drift on for quite some time. But this time, he's really leaving us with what he really wants us to be thinking about as he leaves off of this letter. He says, finally, my brothers, he says, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, he says, think on these things. He says, set your mind on these things, these good and these things of hope and righteousness and these things. He says, be thinking about them, put your mind to them, have them like, these are the things I want you to be thinking about as he's leaving them off. And I think, there's a lot of times that our minds, we want to think, we want to think what we want to think a lot of times. I remember when I used to work in Rochester, and I trust my boss does not watch this. If he does, I'm sorry. But anyway, when I used to work in Rochester, I remember my boss would come in, and he'd be like, listen, guys, from now on, I want you to do this way, and I want you to be doing these things. And we'd be like, yeah, okay, sounds good, sounds like a plan. And he'd walk away, and we'd kind of look at each other like, what a disaster. Does he not know what we do here? Like, this is crazy. So sometimes it's good if he doesn't know what we were thinking. However, we do have to apply ourselves to that. He is the boss, right? What he says, we do, right? And he's in charge, and this is very much the same with God. A lot of times our mind, we don't necessarily want to do things God's way. It's not naturally ingrained in us, but we need to think about those things, and we need to okay, it's like almost a reprogramming. This is what I'm going to make my mind think, and this is how I'm going to think. And I think, many times our minds thinks more like this. We think, I have to do so much around here. There are so many things that I have to do. And we think about ourselves and how it involves us, and then we think about Paul. And Paul is really going to tie all of these qualities into his example of how he showed it to us and how he has lived it out. And you think, as we think about ourselves, and so many times our mind is thinking on ourselves and what we want and the things of us, but Paul says, I'm committed even to the point of death. And it's a very different commitment, his commitment that he's lived and his commitment to God. And we think so many times, I wish I could be treated like this. I feel like I should be treated this way because this is what I'm deserving of. And so many times our minds are just festering on these thoughts of this is what my mind is thinking. But Paul, in a very different way, gives us this example, and he says, be putting others above yourselves, treating them as the more important one. Put them first before you. And he says, literally, we're getting these instructions from God that we need to reprogram the way we think, and then we need to apply that. And so many times I think, we're so focused on how people should be more thankful for us and more grateful for us, as opposed to the way that Paul gives this letter and how he says, we live for God and we live for his kingdom and we live for him alone. And we're really taking a lot of our thoughts and we're really putting them aside, and we're saying God is our boss. He is the one that is in control, and I'm just going to take his thoughts and I'm going to take them on, and I'm going to think on these things, and I'm going to apply these things to my life. So he starts off with this. He says, whatever is true. And it's just, the things that are good, the things of God. Set your mind on okay, this is right and this is righteousness and this is what I'm going to do. He says whatever is honorable. And many times with things that are honorable, they're not easy. This is why we say, wow, that is deserving of honor. That probably wasn't easy, and that probably wasn't selfish. That is something that someone did that we look up to. And I think, again, you're going to see many of the things that he lists they play back to an example that whoever this was, people will look and say, yeah, that was worthy of honor. They're not living for themselves, they're living for other people. And that this is the way he wants our minds to be thinking. You know, it's not going to be easy. He says whatever is just. And again, so many things. They're just, this is right, this is good. It's very simple encouragement. This is the things that you're like, I live for God and his justice. I live for something that is just pure and good, right? And then he goes on, he says, and this is the next one, he says, whatever is pure. He says to be living for the things that are righteous and be getting all of our greedy and our corrupt views from our mind and just be like, okay, I'm going to set my things on just a pure thing. Like I think of like even a child or like an example of something that would be without like malice and hatred and anger, just a very emptied out, like a pure form of service before God. Make your mind want to be this, that you're living to be something like this. And he says, put your mind on whatsoever is lovely. And I wish he said whatsoever is manly, but he didn't. He says on the things that are like lovely. He says the things that are beautiful. But with that, it's still, it is true. It is right. Like you want to, like things that you just look at them and you're like, you know, like you're doing things that you're like, that is a beautiful person. Because you don't get a vibe from them that is just nasty or awful or selfish or just corrupt or anything that, like, it's just beautiful. You're like, oh my goodness, this person is just, they have this beautiful heart. And the service that they have, I look at them and I think, man alive, there's several people here in this church that I have a very high view of their heart of service. And I think, man, it's a beautiful thing. You're like, they had to empty themselves of a lot of selfishness in order to give off that vibe. That you're like, wow, that is just a heart of beauty. And it's something that we want people to be able to look at us and be able to recognize that as something that we're going to need to set our minds and our thoughts on these things. And you know, as we think about these things, especially with this next one, he says, whatsoever is commendable. And you realize so many of these things they really are playing back to how are people going to see you? Like, when you're living out an example for your children, the people around you, the people that see you, like, are they going to say, that is commendable? Like, to live in that way, that is not easy. That is difficult. The things that they do, that is a very commendable lifestyle. And we know this. We know that so many times you can work very hard. And you can try very, very hard to build, and you think, you know, there are times that, like, I hope, so many times I get discouraged when I fail. But I really, really, I've tried so many times in my life to be like, I'm going to buckle down and I'm going to serve with all I have and I'm going to give with all I have and I'm going to love and I'm going to care with all I have and I'm going to press on and I'm going to be all I can be and I'm just going to I want everyone to just be like, he just gives all he can for the people around him. And then you mess up, right? You do something that doesn't come across very well and you feel like you're a failure and you feel like you're ashamed of like, man, I just, that's not how I meant that to come across, right? But you have to rebuild, you have to reestablish, you have to press on, you have to regather and push forward and be like, I want to be living in a way that is commendable. And it's not easy. It takes a lifetime to build up, and we know, we've heard this, right? That's what every parent says to you, right? Like it takes a lifetime to build up a good character, but it takes minutes to tear it down, right? You only have to do one thing that is not commendable in order to have people say, wow, everything that I thought they were, I no longer think that's what they are, right? It takes very little to tear down the reputation that you work very, very hard to build up. But in that, we know that we're all imperfect and we're all going to fail in this, right? So you have to recommit, you have to rebuild, and you have to refocus on these things that are commendable and the things that we ought to be. He says, if there is any excellence and anything worthy of praise, and he says, set your mind on these things. He says, if there's anything that you're going to be like, wow, people would look at that and you think, that is just good, right? It is excellence. It's worthy of praise. It is a lifestyle someone would look at you and they'd be like, they're not going to be like, wow, that person is greedy and grumpy and selfish and self-absorbed and haughty. And no, they're just pure. And they live with this heart of just this kindness and this excellence and this goal and this drive that is just simply, it is pure and good, and it is just good. Like, how do you put it? This is what Paul really is trying to get us to grasp in this whole set. And then he says this in verse 9. He says, what you have learned and received and heard and seen in me. And he says, practice these things and the God of peace will be with you. Now, this is a soapbox that not many of us are ready to climb onto, right? Can we say the things that you have heard and seen and received from me, the life that I have lived, make that your example? Like, wow. Like, Paul has lived out, and I think it's so cool that God has chose him and turned him for who he was and made him live with this extreme passion in his life, that he lives to serve and be and to play out these characteristics, right? And he has shown us throughout this book. You know, he started off in the first chapter by telling them, you know, I'm writing to you with the love of Christ Jesus that I have for you. Like, I care about you so much and so deeply. This is why I'm coming to you in this way. And he talked about in chapter 1 again, towards the end of it, he says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Like, he's totally sold out into his ministry. And he says, like, just to live for God is all that matters. And if I die, that's good. I'll go to heaven. He's fully committed. And in chapter 2, really, he gave us the ultimate example, because our example doesn't start with Paul. Our example starts with Paul is following Christ's perfect example. And Paul wasn't a perfect person, but Paul is head-on committed to living the example that he gave us in Christ. And in chapter 2 was where he really laid that out. And Paul is saying the things that you've heard and received and seen in me, he's like, there's a layer of things that were good to set your mind on that I've shown you. And he has taught us. He first gave us Christ's example, and he says that Jesus, who, when he was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, humbling himself, taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of man, and being found in human form, he humbled himself even on the point of death, even death on the cross. So he's like God himself. He's released anything that he could have kept for himself, and he humbled himself to be this sacrifice before us all that we were undeserving of. This was good, and this was pure, and this was righteous, this was commendable, this was honorable, this was pure, this was lovely, this was beautiful, this was our example. These are the things that he has taught to us. And then Paul goes on to talk about how he is trying to follow up that example. He says in chapter 2, verse 17, how he says, even if I am poured out for you as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I rejoice and am glad with you. He says, if I can be dumped out and spilled out and broken before you as a gift for you, that you might come closer to God, that would be my joy and that would be my pleasure. Like, he is living the example of pure and good and peaceable and lovely and beautiful, that he would live before us as like, what can I do for you that you may achieve the goal that is before you, that I can show you the standard, that I can live it out before you, that you can look at me and be like, this is the example, this is what I ought to be. And he goes on to talk, he says in verse 2, verse 20, he says he's giving us other examples. And he talks about Timothy. He says, for I have no one else like him who will be genuinely concerned about your welfare. He says, I'm sending you other examples. And he says, this person is beautiful. This person, they have genuineness. They have care. When they get there, they're going to be worried about you. They're going to care about you. They're going to love you because this is the person they are. And he goes on and he talks about Epaphroditus, and he says that he nearly died in service to me. And he says, I'm sending these people to you, and he says, honor such men. He says, look at the examples. He says, I'm giving you examples. I'm feeding you examples. And he says, these are people who lived in pure and good and righteous and just like they just grasped to be good. Like, how else can you slice it? Like, they lived to be pure and good and like loving and like to have that selflessness before them, right? That other people is what matters to them. They've lived out this example. And then he says in chapter 3, verse 17, Paul says, brothers, he says, join in imitating me, keeping your eyes on those who walk according to the example that you have in us. And he says, look at the people who walked and lived this out, who've lived like their lives are just a pouring out of the caring, peaceable offering before you. He says, look at them. Look at the people who do this. And like, it's how insane if someone would say that of you. If you could be like, this is the goal that he lays out before you. He's like, this is what you yourself can be. You can be someone who someone looks at you and they say, that is a heart so pure and so gracious in the good that they pursue in this life, that I'm like, It's a beautiful thing that I could pattern my life after and follow after other people who really, really care, who really genuinely care. And he says, follow these patterns. And then he kind of ended off as he's coming into the end of 3 and 3:18. He says, many of whom I have often told you, and now tell you even with tears, walk as enemies of the cross. And he says, their end is destruction, their God is their belly. He says, glorying in their shame with their minds set on earthly things. He says, this is the cross example, right? He says, these people who go through life, and maybe you think they're some level of faith, but he says, honestly, well, let me tell you where their mind is set. And let me tell you what's rolling through their head as opposed to these pure things. It's all of the things of this earth. It's all of the things that they want. It's all of the things that they're longing for, they're not fulfilled in eternity and spiritual. They're fulfilled in themselves. That their own personal desire is where they're fulfilled. And he says, this is the thoughts that are purging through their brains. And he says, I'm asking you to set all of those thoughts aside and be like, I can live with like my goal to live just purely and righteously, that good, that everything I do would be like, this is for good, this is for God, this is for better, this is for the people around me, that I've emptied myself of those thoughts and replaced my mind with these thoughts. So, in closing here, it's a very, very simple message, but also Jesus tells us, he says, like, you are the salt of the earth. He says, you are what is sprinkled in this rotten world to be what gives it good flavor. You are to be this sprinkling that stands out amongst other people, that they're like, wow, this is good. This is the good in the world. And he's like, if the salt has lost its savor, what good is it to be trampled under feet of men? He's like, you are meant to be that good and that pure light in this world. You are meant to be that different in this world. You are meant to be that example that Paul lays out for us in this world. We are supposed to be these things. And I think, especially with my children, and I think of, Paul writing this letter from prison, and, he's thinking about the people that he loves and cares about, and he wants to leave them with this thought. He's just in this brutal outpouring of all things good to put their mind to be this. And I think that this is his purest, best hope and thought for the people he cares about. And I think this about my children many times. I think, I hope, right? You all know me, right? Far from perfect, right? But I hope, so many times I'm like, I hope that they're like, Dad, why are we doing this? And this is for people, guys. This is for others. Like, why are we doing this today? Why are we doing this right now? This is for the hope of serving the people around us. This is for love. This is for care. This is for, I hope that every decision we make and I make, they're like, yes, this is for good. This is that I can follow after. Maybe you're picking up on that we could live as good as we could do for the world, that we could lift up the people around us, to care more about the people around us. And again, it's something that's so hard when you fail. And you need to rake up, you need to regather, you need to be like, it's frustrating when the picture you tried to live for the world turns out flawed, and you're like, man, I gotta work to overcome that and rebuild. And we know that there's forgiveness and mercy from God, right? And we reestablish ourselves, and we recommit ourselves, and we rebuild, and we press forward, and we put these things not just in our mind that we think about them, but that it is our driving force, that we're like, literally, all that is pure and good in this world, all that is righteous and godly, all that is good and caring, all that is commendable and honorable, that you would just be like, this is what I'm going to put my mind to. I'm going to really live to be that, to be an example that people could say, this is what it's meant to be, right? And that is, it's our goal, and it's a real goal. And it takes a lot of getting rid of a lot of rotten stuff in your head that is the mind that thinks on the things of this world. It takes a lot of emptying and making a lot of room, because those things kind of corrupt each other, right? They don't go together. You have to empty out the mind that he says is fixed on this world, and you have to make room for the mind that can be set on the things of God. So I just hope that even in the most simplest of messages, that it seems like, where could you go with that? That it's like, wow, that is also in its own right. It's very powerful that you would set your mind on doing and being whatever is good and right in every way that we can. So let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer this morning. Our God and Father, I just pray that you just help us to continually work towards this goal, Lord, and to understand that there's many frustrations, and many times we're going to fail, and many times we're not going to live up to what we ought to be, but help us to work together to have love and forgiveness amongst ourselves, to have encouragement amongst ourselves, to lift up, to encourage, to press forward, that we would together serve God, to be what we ought to be, to live how we ought to live, to love and care about the people around us, that would be our goal, that we would live for what is right and commendable and honorable, and that you would take from us the desire of this world that is to be seen and recognized, and to have things for ourselves, and in greed and wanting recognition, and just to be like Christ, who has laid down himself for us as unworthy people, Lord, but that we would be able to ultimately look to the pattern that we've been given through Jesus Christ, to follow after that in our unworthiness, but to try our best, Lord. And I just pray that you just help us to press forward towards that. And I pray this in your Son's name. Amen.